In this film, the application of a short forearm cast is demonstrated. In this case, the patient is presenting with a distal radius fracture. If the fracture is displaced, reduction may be required. This is, however, not demonstrated in this film. Before starting the application, the arm is examined. The finger should be examined for mobility, sensation, and capillary refill. The elbow is examined for mobility as well, and the head of the radius is palpated for tenderness. All these examinations are used to detect abnormalities so they can be acted on if necessary. Also, the results can be compared to the physical examination after the cast has been applied. The following materials are needed to apply a short forearm cast. One small stockinette with a width of 2.5 centimeters, a stockinette with a width of 5 centimeters, padding with a width of 7.5 centimeters, 2 rolls of plaster with a width of 7.5 centimeters, and bandage scissors. Do note that the size of the materials used depends on the size of the patient. First, the small stockinette is applied over the thumb. The length of the stockinette, which will be applied around the forearm, is measured. The stockinette should cover the entire forearm and should be long enough to cover the proximal parts of all digits. A hole should be created through which the thumb is passed. The location is decided using the patient's base of the thumb as a landmark, and a small hole is cut. The stockinette is applied over the forearm with the thumb placed through the hole. Note that the stockinette is wrinkle-free, as wrinkling may cause irritation of the skin. Also note that the entire forearm and digits are included in the stockinette. Next, the padding needs to be applied. Care should be taken to apply extra padding over the ulnar prominence to avoid pressure complications. Too much padding should be avoided, as this may cause the splint to be too loose and be able to move over the arm, which may lead to scratches or blisters. The padding is applied so that the flat part is in contact with the limb, allowing easy unrolling. The application is started by encircling the wrist twice, making sure to include the ulnar prominence. It is then placed through the first web space, after tearing the padding to prevent wrinkling, over the wrist, and again through the first web space. The padding is unrolled further proximally until the entire forearm is covered. Note that each turn of padding overlaps the preceding one by 50%. Note that the stockinette is still exposed distally and proximally. This way, it can be folded back as shown here to protect the skin from sharp edges after the cast is applied. Care should be taken not to immobilize the metacarpophalangeal joints. Therefore, the folded edge of the stockinette should be located proximal to these joints, as shown here. It is advised to check if there are no uncovered areas left. This should be avoided to limit the risk of thermal injury of the skin. The roll of plaster is unrolled slightly to identify the free end of the roll. It is advised to hold the roll like this while dipping it in water, as it is hard to identify the free end of the roll once it is wet. Note the air bubbles appearing when the plaster is placed in the water. When these bubbles disappear, the plaster is wet enough. It is squeezed and then application is started at the wrist joint. The wrist joint is encircled twice. The plaster should then be placed through the first web space. Since the plaster is wider than the first web space, care should be taken to cut the plaster from the proximal side as shown here, making sure just 1 to 2 centimeters remain intact. If this is not properly done, too much plaster is placed in the first web space, and the patient will not be able to adduct and flex the thumb after the entire cast is applied. Note that these two parts are folded around the thumb. Another layer is placed over the wrist, creating a window surrounding the thumb. The plaster is again cut on the proximal side and placed through the first web space. It is then further unrolled proximally, taking care that every turn overlaps the preceding one by at least 50%. Care is taken to ensure that the plaster does not exceed the padding proximally. The last piece is cut off, which completes the application of the first roll. The exposed stockinette and padding are now folded back. The padding should cover the sharp edges of the plaster and is then covered by the stockinette. This prevents skin irritation or, even worse, wounds. Again, note that the metacarpophalangeal joints are not included in the cast, and the palmar crease is still exposed. Next, the second roll will be applied. Again, note the air bubbles which are disappearing. Excess water is squeezed out of the plaster, and the application is started again over the wrist joint. It is encircled twice, and the plaster is placed through the first web space after cutting the plaster from the proximal side. It is unrolled further in a proximal direction, leaving the stockinette exposed, and then back distally towards the wrist joint. The plaster is passed for the last time through the first web space, finishing the application of the plaster. The plaster is smoothened. The orthopedic cast technician places his own hand around the thumb to shape the plaster such that it supports the volar side of the thumb sufficiently. Next, moulding of the plaster should be done. In this film, moulding is demonstrated as if the patient has presented with a distal radius fracture, with the distal part of the radius angulated to the dorsal side. One hand is placed on the volar side on the fracture while placing pressure on the radius in a dorsal direction. The other hand is placed on the dorsal side, with the thumb distal to the fracture, and the other digits proximal to the fracture. This hand places pressure on the radius in a volar direction. Note that the wrist joint is slightly flexed to restore the physiological position of the radius as much as possible. Also note that the wrist is deviated to the ulnar side, as this is the natural position of the wrist joint. This can also be done to prevent shortening of the radius. Both hands provide a 1, 2, 3-point fixation of the fracture. The plaster is supported in this position until it is sufficiently hardened. To avoid points of pressure, care is taken to use the flat parts of the hand rather than the fingertips. In case the patient has presented with a distal radius fracture, with the distal part of the radius angulated to the volar side, a different 3-point fixation technique should be used. For a more detailed elaboration of this, refer to the course Volar Forearm Splint. The superficial branch of the radial nerve is located around the radial styloid process, and therefore extra care should be taken not to place the fingertips over this area during moulding. Note that the distance from the cast to the elbow crease is about 2 finger breadths. This is needed to adequately flex the elbow joint when placing the arm in a triangular bandage. Also note that the thumb can be fully flexed, confirming that not too much plaster has been placed in the first web space, and the window of plaster around the thumb is wide enough. The metacarpophalangeal joints of the other digits can be flexed adequately. Finally, the capillary refill is assessed. Imaging studies can be used to examine the fracture after the cast application is completed. Note that the application of the triangular bandage is demonstrated using a clip from a different film, ulnar gutter splint. The application is the same as for the short forearm cast. The longest side is positioned over the shoulder of the unaffected arm. The other side is positioned over the shoulder of the affected arm. A reef knot is used to fixate the triangular bandage. A safety pin is used to attach the triangular bandage to itself, making sure to support the elbow. This completes the application of the triangular bandage. Note that the hand is positioned higher than the elbow to prevent swelling of the forearm and hand. Be aware that a triangular bandage is preferred over a sling, as a sling carries the risk of causing pressure complications via indentations in the plaster.